Well, hello everyone, and thank you ever so much for coming. It's nice to see so many faces, and regular faces as well as that, which is great. Winston Churchill. Now, if you were Australians, I'd say you'd be like Vegemite, or in England we would say Marmite. You either love him or hate him, and that's exactly what happened. First time I gave a talk on Winston Churchill was 1 year after the 50th anniversary of the man's passing. And it was in front of a local club of ours, and I needed to test it on someone, so I tested it on them. We sat down, they sat down in front, but just before we started, rather like now, a couple of people had come up and had a chat, and it was great. And one chap said, "I hate him, I absolutely hate him." I said, "Oh, right," and I should never have asked why, because that was nearly made me late for starting. And then another chap come up and said, "Tremendous, absolutely amazing, man for his time, this, that and the other." So I guided both of them. The first one I said, "Why don't you sit there?" This is going to be a talk, as far as I'm concerned, fairly unbiased, good and bad, in 45 minutes. It'll be interesting to see what you all say afterwards, and please feel free to come up. And then the other chap, who absolutely loved Churchill, I sat next to the fellow that hated him. And I thought, this is going to be interesting. And afterwards, they were both still asking questions. I didn't change their minds, but hey-ho. We'll move on. Great friend of mine at Bletchley Park. He came to Bletchley Park in 1996. Jack Darragh was a wonderful gentleman's gentleman, Irishman from the Irish Guards, in his 70s when he came, 70s. And he'd been an auctioneer most of his life, collected Churchill memorabilia, had something like 10,000 items of Churchill memorabilia, came to Bletchley Park, and that was the first time in 30 years, and he collected for nearly 50 years by the time he left Bletchley Park and retired. He opened up his first exhibition. Where it was, gosh only knows. But when he passed, sadly, his daughter said, "I don't know what to do with it. I've got it in the loft, I've got it in the garage, I've got it everywhere," once I got rid of his house. So it's now, the Bletchley Park Churchill exhibition is actually in the Stratford Armouries, Stratford upon Avon. So that's somewhere to go and see. And that's exactly what it is, an amazing exhibition of quite a bit of Churchill's life, times, and what have you. So here's Winston Churchill laying the foundations in 1959 of the Churchill College, Cambridge. And it was at this time, just after the 50th anniversary of Churchill's death, did my dear friend come up to me and say, "I've got to give the Mountbatten lecture for Churchill College, Cambridge," or Churchill College, he did say, and it's the Mountbatten lecture. And I said, "Oh, that's interesting." He said, "I can't do it. I'm just not well enough and able to do it. Would you do it?" I'm going to give you my notes. In the post, 12 pages of notes turned up, handwritten notes at that, and I had no idea. I could hardly read his writing, let alone his notes. So I had to start from the scratch again, and this is a scratch, and I've basically taken early life, midlife, late life, and tried to put that together in the 45 minutes that we've got for this particular talk. So the Churchill collection was at Bletchley Park from 1995 to 2014, and as I say now, it's in the Stratford Armouries. Bottom left is the Mountbatten lecture. Incidentally, after I'd put the talk together, which took 3 months, he then said, "Well, it's not till June, you've got plenty of time, and it is Churchill College, Southsea near Portsmouth, not Cambridge." So it was to a school called Churchill College, and not quite Churchill College, Cambridge, which is slightly different. So it wasn't as bad as I thought, and it actually was quite fun to do the talk. Top left is his, as I say, is him doing the foundations there at quite an age, as well as you can understand. And on the top right is Bletchley Park, where Churchill came on numerous occasions, but so we were told in 1994. But as we got to know more and more about the stories of Bletchley Park, we found he only ever came once. And the story that he had a direct line to America from Bletchley Park, is the same that you get when you go to various other museums around the country, and they all say the same. Churchill must have been in 15 places at once. So that those myths we're going to put away. And I've got about a dozen myths that I'd like to try and clear, if we can, as we go. Bottom right, stuck that in because Churchill was a Mason, and only put that in because the recently departed Duke of Edinburgh was also a Mason, and people like that don't necessarily say what they do, But the Freemasonry around the world, and certainly in the UK, 50 million they put into charity. In the USA and various other countries, absolutely amazing. So Sir Winston Spencer Churchill. The Churchill descendants are from the Duke of Marlborough line. His mother was an American. Jenny was born in Brooklyn in New York. They were married in the British Embassy in Paris in April 1874. At the very young age of 8, his father was secretary to the Viceroy of Ireland. And I think you thought I was going to say India, but not. The Viceroy of Ireland. And therefore, at that young age, Winston went over there and spent some of his early years in Ireland and loved the place, absolutely loved the place, and still has memories from that time. Sadly, and this is quite sad to me, and I think you may find the same, only ever close to his father that he could record in his books and in his talks 4 times in his life. Now, when you think back to your own parents and your own life, most of us are very lucky and we can think of happy times. And I remember a bar of Mars bar which we had to share, cutting it up into little slices because that's what we had to do. And of course it was so sad. In fact, it was one time when his father came in and he was playing with toy soldiers, and he'd got his attack lined up, his defence lined up, and he'd also got his counter-attacks in place. And his father just stood there and looked at him and then said, you're going to go into the military. And that was Churchill signed, sealed and delivered as far as that was concerned. He then, of course, came back and went to he didn't go to Eton or Cambridge, he actually went to Harrow. And my late wife and I courted in Harrow because she lived in Harrow on the Hill just down the road. And we walked through the town of Harrow, and there were the youngsters then. I mean, this is 1970s, late 60s if I'm honest. And we walked through, and there the boys are hanging out the windows, chatting to each other from window to window, some walking around the town with their straw hats on, and it hadn't changed in all those years. And I think it's probably changed a lot now because they've got girls there now, which is great. So things changed from there. His nanny, he had a nanny, was Mrs. Everest, who he called Woo Manny. And that was left over from when he was ever so young. Sadly, she became very ill in later life, and he was getting on as well. And he stopped what he was doing from a political point of view, and went and stayed with her for a week, which was really quite something from that point of view, and until she died. And that was it. He met and married Clementine Hosier, who he absolutely adored. Lots of stories about Winston Churchill playing away, if you excuse the expression. And to be fair, he loved good-looking women, and he did have some sayings with certain ladies. Lady Astor, for example, said to him, Mr. Churchill, if you were my husband, I'd poison your tea. He said, Madam, if I was your husband, I'd drink it. But there were lots of others like that, and given another time, we'll put the sayings up, and that could be quite fun. One of the myths with Winston Churchill was that he had a speech impediment. He had a stutter. That's not quite right. He had what was called a lateral lisp, and they cured it by pebbles. And as you'll see there, if I can pronounce it, it's Demosthenes pebbles, which is rather like an old-style denture. But it was pebbles, whichever way you look at it. And they felt that they cured it with that. His time in Harrow was well spent. He was, by his one of his head of years, in fact, the head of year, was interviewed on radio many, many years after, when he was in his 80s. And of course, Winston was flying along as such, although at that particular time he was in the political wilderness. And the head of year said, well, of course, he was the second most stupidest boy in the school. And of course, the interviewer, you could it was on radio, so you couldn't see, but you just knew by that second delay that, what? And he said, well, the first most stupidest boy in the school was his brother. So, of course, he wasn't a Churchill fan at all from that point of view. Military service, we're moving now. He's moving into the military service. At school, certainly in Harrow, you had 2 chances. If you were lucky, you got a 3rd chance. And he was lucky, he got a 3rd chance for the military exams. First 2, not too good. And the third one, he revised for a week. Now, there were 7 different subjects or 7 different questions that you would have to answer, and then subdivided into those were other questions. He revised on one subject and one subject alone. Now, I don't know how he knew that was going to come up in the exam, but it did, and he passed. The problem he had was the pay. He really couldn't survive on the pay. So mother and father said we put something towards it, and they put towards it was a £500 a year was the pay into the forces as a junior officer. I guess that equates to about 50,000 now, so it wasn't bad wages at that time. But anyway, he couldn't afford it, and he was £100 a year short. So he joined the military attaché, so he was actually a war correspondent. So he technically was in the forces, but technically not in the forces because he was a war correspondent. And it was that took him in his first opportunity to Cuba, where he got the love of cigars, which was really quite something. Not because these young girls were rolling the cigars on their thighs. I'm sure that wasn't the case. It was the taste of cigars. And if ever you see Churchill with a cigar in his mouth, they weren't always lit. He was more sucking them than actually smoking them, but that's a but you'll see films, and just take my word for it, watch them and keep your story, see how you feel from that. So one of his writings was about Kitchener's, one of his war epics and one of his episodes there, and he upset Kitchener to the point that he did say in one of his other writings that I'm never going to get anywhere in the military because Lord Kitchener's got it in for me. I don't stand a chance after what I said, and he wasn't happy. Well, Kitchener was a military man, and the fact is that made no difference. He wasn't happy with what Churchill said, and you can read that now if you wish, because there's lots of books he wrote, and I'll come on to a little bit about his books a bit later. And Churchill then still got back in, and he got back in to the cavalry. In fact, he was involved in one of the last cavalry charges. So that shows you. The men in the cavalry platoon that he was in said that he was one of the best officers they've ever had. He did look after his men, although he did make some rather big boobs when he was there. One of his things was he's a really good polo player. There was no doubt about that, right? Like Duke of Edinburgh and like a lot of the royalty nowadays, although he wasn't royalty by any means or so. But he did, in the cavalry, going to the stables, and the sergeant at arms, the in charge of the stables, greeted him, and it was the first time he'd ever met him, and they passed niceties as such, and he said, "What's that man doing over there, Sergeant?" And he shouldn't be doing that, and he was sweeping out the stables. He said, "That man, sir, does what I tell him to do. I'm in charge of the stables, and he will. If I tell him to sweep out the stables, he sweeps out the stables. He has to look after his horses. The horses respect it, and it works." So Churchill walked out with his tail between his legs, and he came back in another time and said to Sergeant, he said, "Sergeant, what's that man doing there? I can do that if you like." He said, "You're not cleaning out the horses' hooves," he says. "Sir," he says, "I do that." And of course, there's nothing worse if you've been in the military, and especially if you're a NCO, non-commissioned officer. You can say "sir" in such a way that it's a real insult, and you don't have to swear. You just say, "No, sir." It's very easy to say, and this is exactly what the sergeant did. So again, poor old chap went out with his leg between his tail between his legs, as they say. So we're now into we've gone through the war correspondence. The Second Boer War was where as a war correspondent still, Churchill went into war, and he was on a train, and this train with the Boers obviously aiming to attack them was blocked. So the train got to a certain level and couldn't go on any further. Therefore, the instruction by the officer in charge, and Churchill was just a war correspondent, bear in mind at that stage, was you must retreat, reverse the train. By this time, the Boers had got in and put so much on the track at the back of them some way back, they couldn't reverse much further, and they were stuck. And therefore, the Boers' entrapment worked, and they were in trouble. It was here that Churchill came to his fore and took charge in a certain area and helped out considerably after 2 senior officers had been slain and they were losing. They lost the whole battle. They were captured. Churchill was shown, and there's lots of pictures of him being flouted around purely because his name was well known. By this time, he'd already been a politician for a short period, and excuse me, and by this time he was literally being shown as the person to capture and to take as a hostage. And of course the Boers thought they got it. Fortunately, Churchill had got on with some locals and he managed to escape. Now, this was quite important because he was able to get away and get back. How he did it from where he was because there was enough interest in the locals to help from that side. They put a warrant on for him, something to the tune of £25, for which, again, nowadays, you're looking at a fair few £1,000s. He moved to the Western Front, and he was involved greatly on the Western Front, now in the military, with the provision of the tank. Now, they called it the land ship. The first ever tanks were land ships. And Churchill made a bit of a boo-boo. He had, and you'll remember, you got lots of pictures of Winston in onesies. And he'd lost the plans and papers for this new land ship, this new tank. And of course, it was a serious problem because he was in panic mode, and unfortunately, too many military people have left computer stuff on trains and things like that, and that's caused lots of problems in more modern times. But then it was quite serious. Found them tucked in the bottom leggings of his onesies, so he was out of trouble. But at that stage, he could have been in real bother. In Ypres, we're now in the Somme, and just further round, we've got Ypres, or as Churchill would call it, and of course it's spelt Y-P-R-E-S. Churchill's name for it was not Ypres, but Wipers. And that's what he is, an Englishman that can never speak foreign languages. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Scots Royal Fusiliers. That group, again, the soldiers reminisced for many, many years after, as he was one of the best lieutenant colonels they had, and again, he looked after his men. In Ypres itself, in the main town area, there's a wonderful plaque on the wall to Winston Churchill, which was put up by the French. And as we all know, the French don't, they don't give easily because they're that way inclined, and that's their normal nature. But in this instance, there was an awful lot of thought that got into this, and it's quite emotional to see something like that. Again, whether you liked him or hated him, at least people paid their respects in the right ways. Moving to his political career, we've got this picture. When I first saw it, or when I first realised, a young politician now who was very much like Churchill in many ways, scruffy. Need I say any more? Who does he remind you of? Who's going to say Boris? No, you can't say that. I can't believe you said that. But the man at the right time. Churchill was the man at the right time in World War II, and maybe Boris is or not now. It's entirely up to you. I'm not a political animal, so it's quite lovely. And the fact that Boris wrote his first book, full book, on Churchill was quite something. I've got one with me, so if anybody afterwards wants to come up and have a nose, I know we haven't got a lot of time, but if you want to borrow it for the afternoon, do please ask. I'll be more than happy. Just don't bend the pages because I'm going to use it for other things. Chancellor, 1924 to 29. Now, that was, from a military point of view, quite frightening because he sold off the Navy. Financially, he had no choice, but the Navy, whilst he was involved, he still, as a Chancellor, did what the Chancellor has to do and make financial cuts. And the military did feel sold out, particularly the Navy. And of course, he was involved with the Navy for a considerable amount of time. He made quite a lot of boo-boos in that area as well. He said about Gandhi, he said, if that chap goes on strike again, hunger strike, don't feed him. Now, that was not a clever move at all, and certainly not a political move that went down too well. German rearmament, and he felt was completely out of order, shouldn't happen. You see, at the end of World War I, the Germans didn't surrender. It was a truce, but they did agree that they would only have a certain number, 250 or whatever it is, military aircraft to defend their land with, a certain number, I think it was 75,000 military personnel, and X number of ships. They'd multiplied by 4 the number of ships, by 10 the number of aircraft, and by hundreds of thousands the military in mid-1935. So, of course, Churchill was dead against them being allowed to carry on in this way, and it unfortunately proved to be right. And so, therefore, he was against that. But that didn't do him much good as far as the political wilderness was concerned, and he was kept in the political wilderness quite a considerable amount of time. As far as the abdication of the king, he felt again that he should back the king, and it was important to back the king. And once again, it was proven that it was going the wrong way. However, he did admit his failures with Gallipoli and India and the abdication, and I think that on its own was something, although many people have never forgiven him. 3rd of September, war was declared, 1939. Churchill, because he was in charge of the Admiralty way back in his early years, the signal went round to all the ships, Winston is back, which is quite something. They might not have forgiven him in certain areas, but he was quite something from that side. Speeches, you remember lots of the speeches: blood, sweat, toil, tears, and various others. I've dropped a few notes up there. It's brilliant VDU and visual on these ships with Viking, so therefore you can read those, and it saves me ringing them out. There's something down there about Bletchley Park and SOE. It was the previous Prime Minister who pushed for SOE, Special Operations Executive, but it was Churchill that actually opened it up and got it moving. And the Special Operations Executive is an amazing story, and it was Churchill when in one of his writings he said, go to Europe and burn it. And that's almost what they did. And bear in mind, there were as many ladies and women trained for SOE as there were men. So the Special Operations Executive was really quite something. And Dwight Eisenhower, the letter of gratitude, which I showed you on the first talk, and you can see it on your screens. As you know, all these films are on the screens on the ship, and they're very useful to go back to if you want to from that side. Coventry, the bombing of Coventry in 1941, it was said that Churchill sacrificed Coventry. Let's make this quite clear, it wasn't. If we're going to blame anybody, I blame Bletchley Park, although it wasn't quite as easy as that. Bletchley Park had decoded the signal, and the signal they got that they were going to bomb Cologne. Now, Cologne was the German code, and of course, because there's a little village on the south-south-west of London, they thought, well, that's where they're coming in from in their way to bomb London. So therefore, everything was impacted and organised to defend London. Of course, it was a problem in so much as they went straight past London. Churchill was actually on the top, on the roof, with one of his secretaries who was rather frightened, and he said to her, well, you better go down. And she said, no, I'm staying with you, sir. And of course, they could see the aircraft, and they were just going past London. Coventry had the why and wherefore to defend itself. It had the balloons to stop the aircraft getting in a position where they could attack. It didn't get the balloons up early enough. It had the counterattacks available. They weren't called in early enough. And of course, as we know, we're talking about many, many thousands of deaths and an awful lot of damage in Coventry. And again, technically, Bletchley Park sent them the code and said, well, we can only break this code as Cologne, and therefore we suspect this is where it is. But obviously the military people have to make their own decisions, and that's how it went. Sadly, he had a stroke in 1943 whilst he was Prime Minister, was hushed up. They said he's not going to work for 6 months if he can ever work again. He was back in his office within 2 weeks and 1 day. The war ends, of course, and Winston Churchill is back in the wilderness, and again, mainly his own fault, but we won't go there. 1949, Winston was taking time off to actually go and visit Madeira with his wife. And he'd been invited, and he'd got a diplomat over there who then set up various places for him to visit, Blandy's and this, that and the other. And Blandy's had actually said, we're going to send you a crate of wine, Madeira wine and brandy, which of course works well for Winston. And when he got back, and I'll tell you the story about his timing in Madeira. But when he got back, within 2 months, he'd sent a letter to Blandy's saying it was ever so kind of you to offer me the wine and the brandy, but it hasn't yet arrived. Well, that's one way of chasing them up. Well, if ever you go into Madeira, you've got to go into the Blandy's store, because they've got an amazing museum, and as you do the tour afterwards, apart from the fact you get some tastings, you can go up through the museum, and there's the letter from Blandy's in the first place, the second letter from Winston saying, well, where is it? And then the letter from Blandy's saying, thank you ever so much, and then the letter from Winston saying it's arrived. Thank you, really appreciate it. Quite what happened to the first lot, we don't know if ever it was sent. he was due to arrive on the 31st of December 1949, and the weather was atrocious, and the ship had to shield, guests coming through the Bay of Biscay, as many of you know, and had to shield and shelter. And he was a day late, and they cancelled the fireworks, not because of Winston Churchill, and he never even thought that the case, but because the weather was so atrocious. And the fireworks, if you've ever been anywhere in the world, that's the place to go to on the 31st of December. They were then a day late, and they played them a day late, and Churchill had arrived. His main object was to do some painting, and he painted in Camera de Lobos, which, if anybody you know, is just a bit further up from the main city, the Funchal, and to this day they're still dining out on it. If in fact, in the last 3 years ago, they built a Churchill hotel in Camera de Lobos, the first new hotel to be built outside of the two main tourist areas, and it's a unique hotel. We were very lucky in so much as we were able to get some material from our dear friend who got some spare Churchill memorabilia, and we sold it to them for €300, and the money went to an orphanage in Madeira, which was really good, and it's still there to this day. So something to do. And I'm not being paid by the tourist board, just like Madeira. That's all. Winston always had financial problems, and I'm going to come on to his alcohol and financial problems in a short while, but he always had financial problems, and a lot of it was down to Truman and the fact that he lost at poker. And in fact, he raised a considerable amount of funds to pay off his debts and to finance him for more gambling, which very few people know about. And he sold off the rights to the serialization in films of his books, and he wrote quite a few books. One of the other things that Churchill admitted to was his depression, which he didn't call depression, he called it black dog. And that was something that, again, is quite frightening when you understand that he was in charge of one of the most powerful organisations in the world at that time, and he suffered quite seriously. He didn't let it get to him from that side. Series of strokes we've mentioned there from 1949 to 1956, and he actually retired as Prime Minister in 1955 and moved out of the political wilderness. And here's where he retired to. It's quite a place. It's where his family had owned for many years. He wasn't sure quite what he was going to do when he retired, but he decided that he'd spend most of it here at Chartwell, some of it in Hyde Park Gate, and a little bit of it at Coco Chanel's villa in the French Riviera. He picked his hobbies. He picked bricklaying, which was something he always wanted to do, and even to this day there are walls there that he laid the bricks on. When he first started, he applied to the Guild of Master Craftsmen to be acknowledged as a bricklayer, and they sent a representative down. Now, how can you not pass the ex-Prime Minister, Winston Churchill? Well, they made him work, and they made him do certain activities with bricks, laying the bricks, getting the perps, which is the perpendicular, so each brick where the joint is above alternate, it had to be the same. He had to work out English garden wall bond, which is a completely different, and all things like that, stretcher bond, that you name it. And he did it, and he got it, and he earned it, every part of it. He painted over 500 pictures. Anybody know what name he painted under? Charles Moran. Well done, I heard that. Well, if I didn't hear it, you made it up, but you did it right. 500 pictures, and his most well-known picture was the fish pond, bought by Brad Pitt and Angela Jolie for 1.2 million. Quite what they did when they split all their bits and pieces up and divorced, I don't know, but you couldn't cut a painting up like that. 1.2 million, that was really quite a result from his point of view. There were numbers of pictures that hadn't been found. Some are still coming out of the now from all kinds of places that he'd passed them on to, or some people looked after. If ever you go down here to Chartwell, you've got to go and see where he painted, because as you go down, you've just gone back in time, and it just looks as if that cigar has only just gone out, and that paintbrush is still wet. That's how accurate it is. And as you go in, they have these volunteers, amazing volunteers, that are guides, that are just talking to you about the pictures and the paintings, and they tell the stories, which is really quite special from that. And then the other hobby he took up was butterflies. Again, the butterflies were important to him because he felt they were such beautiful creatures. But within a few years, he felt that capturing butterflies who have such a short life expectancy was cruel. And he decided that he would stop doing that, and that was it. He was helped by his daughter Mary, and Mary helped him in the garden, helped him with the butterflies. And I met Mary Soames, which is was her married name. She came to Bletchley Park 2 or 3 times to look at the Churchill collection and to open up new bits of Churchill as it came in. When we got the bell from the Havengor, the ship that took, or the little boat that launched that took Churchill's body down the Thames, and that was donated on loan. It's now back in the Havengor, which is a museum piece, by the way. And she came to just launch the fact that that was on loan and what have you, and wrote about her father and said some amazing bits and pieces. Sotheby's have recently got for possible auction, but it's now been argued that they really should be kept for the nation, some other pictures. So that's something to keep your eyes open for. That could be quite interesting if that comes up. As regards to serious health issues, things soon after he retired, he only really lasted about a year, 18 months. When I say he retired from politics, and it was those issues that became a problem. He decided soon after retiring out of politics that he was actually going to organise his own funeral. And he was told in no uncertain terms that the Queen had already decided, and bear in mind our Queen Elizabeth II has gone through 21 Prime Ministers now, I think it is. Well, she hasn't quite gone through Boris, but she's not far off it. But she seriously had already decreed that he would have a state funeral. And so therefore he was told, well, you know, you can't organise your own funeral, I'm sorry. So he said, well, that's okay, but I'm not having that chap de Gaulle coming to my funeral, not after what we went through in World War II. So, of course, shock horror, they said, well, he hasn't got a lot of choice, he's got to come. So Churchill thought about it and he said, right, well, we're going to have my funeral cortege going from Waterloo Station. I'll get one over on him if it's the last thing I do. And that's what happened. They agreed. They first of all said to him, you can't go from Waterloo Station because there isn't a direct line to Broaden. Well, he said, there is. We can change. And he worked out where the lines had to change to get through. So he got his way as regards to that. He did make the quote, I'm prepared to meet my maker. Whether my maker is prepared to meet me is a different matter. So that was one that went down in history. Quite knows what happened, I don't know. His funeral, which I'm going to show you in a few minutes, was quite something. It was something to behold. You will notice that the 8 pallbearers were struggling with the weight. It was a lead-lined coffin. And it was only the 50th anniversary of his death that a note came up where we live, Anne and I live in the West Midlands, that the Coffin Works in Birmingham were going to do a talk on Churchill. Now, I just started prep for doing a number of Churchill talks, so we went along and sat with it, and they'd found the handles from Churchill's coffin, not the actual handles, but a model of the handles, which they'd sold for Churchill's coffin. So they were dining out on the fact the handles in Churchill's coffin. Now, these 8 pallbearers all came to Bletchley Park, and all by one, came to Bletchley Park and all signed the book in the memorabilia exhibition that was at Bletchley Park and is now, as I told you, is at Stratford Armouries. And that was quite something because the chap who owned the collection got some wonderful stories. And one of them, or in fact 2 of them, said and told him that we were in trouble because the Prime Minister decided on the steps that he'd stop. And of course, you know, these are very steep steps, especially in St Paul's. And the poor 8 pallbearers had to hold. And if it hadn't been for the Master at Arms at the back, just putting his hand up, anything could have happened. So, of course, you know, prime ministers are always having a go at each other. I don't know why, but stopping there could have been quite something. His final stroke was the 15th of January 1965, and sadly he passed away just 9 days later. You'll see there, largest state funeral, which it was at the time, attended by the Queen at St Paul's Cathedral. 112 nations attended, including de Gaulle. In a film clip, which you're going to see in a short while,
you'll see de Gaulle and it looks as if he's been stuck in the middle of nowhere. It's not. It's just the way that people interpret that poor old de Gaulle was left out in the wilderness. It's not quite right, but it does give you an impression. 350 million people watched on TV. That at that time got to be a record. And he laid in state, and a number of people come up to me and say, I went there, I made a point of going there, and you'll see how people were filing through, and a tremendous amount went through. Didn't record it, which is such a shame. Didn't record the numbers and the people. That could have made a book on its own from there. And the train from Waterloo to Broaden, I've explained in no uncertain terms. So, 20 books he wrote. But there's been probably 10 times that amount written about him. Even now I know of 2 that are underway, and the recent one from Boris is not bad. I have to say, if you want something to understand about a writer for another person, you can read more into it than perhaps what he's writing. Nobel Peace Prize, when it was announced that he got the Nobel Peace Prize, he was over the moon. He said, great, is it peace? And of course he got it wrong. It wasn't the Nobel Peace Prize, it was a Nobel Prize for Literature. And he wasn't happy bunny at all, which is a shame. Not that he deserved the Peace Prize. I wouldn't debate on that for numerous reasons. But certainly the prize for literature was quite good. In fact, the Prime Minister once said, I never respond to Winston's questions without putting it in writing. That way he has to print it in his book, because invariably he would write what he felt the answer was to suit his own ends, which is a little bit naughty. So Attlee said, and so did others, that we would always put it in writing as a response, as well as stand up and respond to him, so that he had to print it in his book. I've told you Charles Morin, as he painted under, and the landscapes of south of France, Egypt, Morocco, even to this day in Morocco, where they dine out on Churchill's painting, which wasn't a particularly good one in my opinion, but I'm not very good on artistic. And Madeira was quite something. He was only there 12 days, bless him, and of course the Prime Minister at the time decided that he'd call a general election while Churchill was away, thinking he'd gone for 2 months, and he just got on the next ship and came straight back to fight the election. And of course, as you know, he then won back his prime ministership for 5 years, well, 4 years and a bit. And so that was quite something. Left his dear lady there, and to this day, Reed's Palace, if ever you go there, and if the suite is not occupied, do ask at reception, because they are ever so proud to take you in. In fact, I did a talk for Reed's Palace, which is the second time. So I was practicing on Reed's Palace in Madeira, my talk on Churchill, before I went to do it at what I thought was Churchill College, Cambridge, and as I said, was Churchill College in Southsea, Portsmouth. But I went there and practiced on them, and I said, and the Churchill suite, what are we looking at? And she said, it's about $1,795 a day. What? So we went there and they took us through it, a beautiful suite, and the pictures they have on their postcards of Winston and his dear lady are really something to see, and worth going in. And it's still the best value for money for tea on the thing, but you do need a jacket. So cream teas in Reed's Palace is quite something. So we're looking at the novels that he wrote, and as a writer, 2 biographies, 3 volumes of memoirs, the Nobel Prize for Literature, as we said, 1953, 6 volumes of the Second World War. That was the volumes that he sold for serialisation, and you've probably seen a number of films that have been brought and then reissued and then revamped and brought out again, and 4 volumes of the history of the English-speaking people. And so there's quite a bit there, considering he was also Prime Minister and through the largest war that we'd had up till then. Churchill myths. I've tried to deal with most of these before we get there, but this is really a memory jogger. Sent troops against the striking Welsh miners. That didn't happen. What happened was he went there and got told off for being there whilst there was some problems going on. The army was instructed by others to go in and take control, and he made the telephone call and said, no, you will not send them in. As it was, they were sent in later, but not at that stage. So in actual fact, initially, he stopped it. he may not have had the opportunity to redo much on that score from that point of view. The bit about Turing, he said Turing was an amazing character and this, that, and the other. He didn't say anything about the single biggest contribution. I'll put my teeth in better next time. He didn't say that at all. In fact, he probably wouldn't have known who Turing was. There was, as you may have seen in the film, The Imitation Game, which is an amazing film. Well, 80% of it is. The other 20% was made up. But having said that, he and 7 others signed a petition to Churchill. You see, when Churchill came to Bletchley Park, he literally came for the one-off meeting, and in fact, when he came out, he saw them playing what we know as rounders. But I think I mentioned in one of the earlier talks, he thought they were playing American baseball, and he said, "Well, I'm not having a foreign game here. Build them a tennis court." And we have now reproduced the tennis court, exactly the same position, with the old tennis hut, which we refurbished, and it looks like it's just been brand new. And they were playing rounders, and therefore you'll hear a sound system of the girls and the boys playing rounders and linking up with an American who was playing our rounders game, which is fantastic because he knows how to hit right balls, which was quite good. But we always say, and we have a little bit of fun because we get a lot of American visitors as well as Germans and all kinds of others, that the Americans invented baseball because they could never hit a small rounders ball with a little bat like that. They needed a bat like that with a big ball like that. And I do get some iffy ones on that, but it's great fun, and we have some great bits on that side. So that's covered most here. Alcohol abuser, I'm going to deal with that now. You can make your own mind up on that. Let Coventry we dealt with. Dresden's payback for Coventry. That was Bomber Harris. The RAF commander was a chap by the name of Bomber Harris. It was his nickname. And it was he that decided the only way to get this sorted was to carpet bomb. Not necessarily a clever move, but it was a move at the time. And when we complain about how London was bombed, nothing compared to some of the German cities. So we have an awful lot to look back on and consider in various ways. Churchill would have had a little bit of inkling on that because he was in charge of the committee as such, but not necessarily what was sent and when it was sent and how it was sent. And that was blamed on poor old Bomber Harris, who was really doing what he was told to do, and that was to reduce the take of armaments, and the aim was, of course, to hit the factories. And of course, with things like that, it's always the civilians that suffer. Suffer from Alzheimer's disease, never actually proven, but I have to say, and quite a few of you in here are maybe not as old as me, but I go into the bathroom and forget what I've gone in the bathroom before I go into the bedroom and forget what when I went in there, unless the sheets are turned down and I know it's bedtime. But that's age, and that was quite normal, and I think he was no worse or better than the rest of us. And of course, Bessie Braddock and he clashed. She said to him at one event, "Mr. Churchill, you're disgustingly drunk." And he said, "Madam, you're disgustingly ugly, but tomorrow I shall be sober." I knew you'd laugh, sir. And of course, I told you about the poison in the tea. Churchill's wine cellar. How about this? 1908. I'm not going to read it all, but you can work it out. 9 dozen bottles of Pol Roger champagne, 7 dozen half bottles of the same vintage. And that was a cellar bill, $75,000. I changed it from pounds because I thought you were all going to be Americans, so that was wonderful to see so many British. And he owed that to Randolph Payne and Sons, the family wine merchants. I'll leave it to you. He needed alcohol to function. It was something he relied on. I guess his body, to a certain extent, came to use it. These are his honours. I'll leave those, and I can show you those if anybody wants to know more. But basically, we've gone through most of them. And the 2002 British poll of the 100 greatest Britons, he was proclaimed the greatest of them all. Apart from, unfortunately, that was redone again, and Turing beat him to it the next time. I'm going to just give you this.
Ladies and gentlemen, Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. Thank you.